In the winter of 1880, 9 people were trapped in a small building on the Dakota prairie. No trains, no coal, no food coming. Outside, blizzards hit so often that some weeks they couldn't see past the windows. One of those 9 people was a 14-year-old girl named Laura Ingalls. She spent that winter twisting prairie hay into fuel and grinding wheat by hand to keep the others alive. Years later, she'd write a famous book about it. But before we get to the book, you need to hear what actually happened. The Ingalls family wasn't supposed to be in Dakota Territory at all. A few years earlier, back in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, they'd had a baby boy named Freddie, born in November of 1875. He lived 9 months and 26 days. County records say he died of infant diarrhea. As Laura later wrote that he was never healthy and suffered fits before he died. They buried him near South Troy, Minnesota, in a grave that's since been lost. No marker survives. After Freddie died, the family didn't push west. They went east to Burr Oak, Iowa, where Charles Ingalls tried to run a hotel. It failed. The family was broke, grieving, and moving in the wrong direction. They eventually went back to Walnut Grove, and only then, years later, continued on to Dakota Territory. Late in life, Caroline Ingalls said simply that everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. By the time the family reached a small railroad town called De Smet in 1879, they'd already been broken once. That matters for understanding what happened next. De Smet sat on flat, treeless prairie, connected to the outside world by a single railroad line. The whole town was barely a year old, a handful of wooden buildings along a dirt road, a few dozen families at most. The town depended on that railroad line for everything: coal, flour, groceries, mail. If the trains stopped, the town stopped. In mid-October of 1880, the trains stopped. A massive blizzard swept across the territory with almost no warning. There's a newspaper from that week, the Canton Advocate, that describes a storm that arrived with thunder and lightning, which is almost unheard of for a snowstorm, and produced drifts so deep they buried entire sections of track. Nobody saw it coming, and it was only the beginning. What followed was blizzard after blizzard for months on end, and weather data pulled together years later showed snow falling on 47 of 59 days in January and February alone. Temperatures dropped to 35 below zero, but the cold wasn't even the worst part. The real disaster was the railroad. Every time crews tried to dig out the tracks, another blizzard buried them again. The drifts weren't just deep, they were constant. At one stretch west of Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, the snow piled up faster than anyone could move it. The railroad gave up trying. Almanzo Wilder's sister, Eliza Jane, was living in De Smet that winter, and she wrote a letter that ended up in the National Archives. It's one of the best first-hand accounts we have of what life was actually like. She describes the October blizzard, repeated railroad blockages, and then this. After mid-December, no trains reached De Smet until May. Of 5 months. No coal, no flour, no groceries, no mail, and no way out. Nobody in De Smet knew what was happening anywhere else. No letters were moving, no news was coming in. They didn't know if other towns were surviving or starving. They didn't know if anyone was trying to reach them. All they knew was what was right in front of them, and what was right in front of them was snow. That kind of silence is terrifying. The worst stretch ran from January through early May, about 100 days with the tracks completely shut down. Eliza Jane's letter describes settlers grinding wheat in coffee mills and eating turnips and coarse bread as supplies ran out. At Yankton, lows hit 39 below in January and 49 below in February. She wrote that many families were reported frozen to death across the territory. And inside a store building on Main Street in De Smet, Laura and 8 other people were trying to make it through. One of them would make it harder for everyone else. The Ingalls family had moved off their homestead claim before winter because the claim shanty, a tiny one-room shack with no insulation, couldn't survive the cold. The store building on Main Street was sturdier, but it was small and dark, and it was never meant to house this many people. Charles and Caroline Ingalls, their daughters Mary, Laura, Carrie, and Grace. That's 6. But there were 3 more. A couple named George and Maggie Masters had been living with the Ingalls family since before the blizzard started. Their baby son Arthur had been born right there at the Ingalls home in May of 1880. Maggie had been boarding with the family while George was away working for railroad contractors. When George came back in the fall, the Ingalls expected them to leave. They didn't. They were out of money and had nowhere else to go, and so they just stayed. Now picture what Laura's daily life looked like. The coal ran out early. After that, the only way to heat the building was to twist prairie hay into tight sticks and burn them. Someone had to do that every single day, twisting and twisting until their hands were raw. They ground wheat in a hand coffee mill 1 meal at a time, turning the crank for what felt like hours to get enough coarse flour for a single batch of bread. And the light was almost gone. With no kerosene coming in on the trains, they spent most of their time in the dark. When a blizzard hit, and blizzards hit constantly, they couldn't leave. They just sat there, all 9 of them, in a dark building, waiting for it to pass. Sometimes the blizzards lasted 3 days. Sometimes they came one right after another with only a few hours of clear sky between them. During those breaks, people would rush outside to do whatever they could before the next one hit. And Laura was doing most of the hard work. Laura didn't hide how she felt about it. George, she said, was lazy and spoiled. While Laura was out doing the work that kept everyone alive, George wouldn't lift a hand, wouldn't help with the hay, wouldn't take a turn at the mill, wouldn't do livestock chores. Laura was 14. Her sister Mary was blind. She'd lost her sight a few years earlier after a fever, and by the winter of 1880, she couldn't do anything that required seeing where she was going. But she could work by feel, and she did. The 2 of them, along with their parents, did the work that kept 9 people breathing. And when the food came out, George would rush to eat more than his share, while the family rationed so that Maggie, who was nursing the baby, could have enough. Laura said that times like this test people, and we were getting to know George and Maggie. When spring came, the Masters left De Smet. But Laura never forgot what George did that winter, or what he didn't do. That was Laura's life, day after day, and it went on and on and on. October, November, December, January, February, March, April, 7 months. But inside that building wasn't the whole story. Out in the town, a few ordinary people were doing what they could between blizzards to keep everyone fed. And one man had more than he was letting on. And the town's main source of wheat that winter came from a settler named Amos Whiting, whose family had harvested 500 bushels before the winter hit. Between blizzards, townspeople hauled sleds out to the Whiting farm and bought what they could carry back. That's what people were eating: Whiting's wheat. Almanzo Wilder's cousin, Charles Lamson, set up a big coffee grinder in town and ground roughly 50 bushels of Whiting's wheat into flour over the course of the winter. That kept people alive. There was also a Norwegian immigrant named Niels Andersen Kopperud, who had a land claim about 6 miles south of De Smet. He had a wife named Marin, a newborn son, 2 houses, and a big stable. He sold wheat, too. Those are the people who kept De Smet fed. But there's one more part of this story, and it changes the picture completely. At some point during the winter, Almanzo Wilder may have made a trip out to buy wheat from Copperwood. The Wilder family later said he did, riding about 12 miles round trip and bringing back around 30 bushels. But no newspaper from that time mentioned it. Nobody in town seems to have written it down. No one outside the Wilder family ever confirmed it happened. It may be true. But even if it was, 30 bushels is nothing next to the 500 that Whiting was selling all winter long. And then there was Almanzo's own wheat. Before the winter started, he had hauled a supply of seed wheat from his mother's land in Minnesota and hidden it behind a false wall in his brother Royal's store. He refused to sell any of it all winter, insisting he needed it for spring planting. As Royal urged him to sell at the rising prices and take the profit, Almanzo said no. By April, before any supply train had arrived, Almanzo and Royal were already out seeding their fields. Their hidden supply had survived the entire winter intact. Think about that for a second. While Laura was grinding wheat by hand, one meal at a time, and the rest of the town was hauling sleds through blizzards to buy what they could from Whiting, Almanzo had his own supply sitting behind a wall. He wasn't starving. He was protecting an investment. Laura would marry Almanzo 4 years later. She never mentioned the hidden wheat in her book. Now there's one more thing you need to know about De Smet, and it's the thing nobody talked about at the time, and nobody writes about much even now. Île de Smet was built on land that had just been taken from the Great Sioux Reservation. The Lakota people had lived on that land long before any settler arrived. In 1880 and 1881, while Laura and her family were fighting to survive, Sitting Bull's band was surrendering at Fort Buford after years of resistance. The whole reason the Ingalls family and everyone else could even be there was because the Lakota had been forced off that land. Every homestead claim, every railroad town, every store building where families huddled through the blizzards, all of it sat on ground that had belonged to someone else a few years earlier. And then the winter ended, but not the way anyone expected. When the first train finally pushed through in early May, De Smet had been cut off for nearly 5 months. Food, coal, mail, news from the outside world. It all came pouring in at once. For a few days, it felt like the worst was over. The sudden thaw of 1881 sent months of built-up snow into the rivers all at once. It happened fast. 1 week the prairie was frozen solid, the next it was underwater. The Missouri and Mississippi flooded badly. The town of Yankton was nearly destroyed. Roads in Kingsbury County were useless into June as the prairie turned to shallow lakes. Farmers could literally boat from their homesteads into town. After everything those families had survived, after everything Laura had done to keep 9 people alive through 5 months of blizzards, the spring flooding killed more people than the entire winter had. And almost nobody remembers it. None of this is hidden. It's all in the history, in letters and county records and weather data and land claims. Anybody can look it up. But for about 80 years, almost nobody did, because there was a much more famous version of this story sitting on bookshelves in millions of homes. And that version told a very different tale. Laura Ingalls Wilder grew up and wrote a book about that winter called The Long Winter. It became part of the Little House series, which sold tens of millions of copies and shaped how Americans picture life on the frontier. There was a television show. There were dolls and lunchboxes and homeschool curriculums built around these books. If you read them growing up or read them to your kids, you probably thought they were true. They weren't. Not the way you think. In the book, there are 6 people in that building, not 9. George and Maggie and the baby are gone. The freeloader who wouldn't work, and the woman nursing a baby while her husband ate everyone's food. The resentment of 9 people crammed together with not enough to go around. All of it erased. And Laura didn't make these changes alone. Nobody knew it at the time, but her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, helped edit and reshape every single book in the series. Rose wasn't some amateur. She'd been a successful journalist and novelist in her own right, had traveled across Europe and the Middle East, and knew exactly how to shape a story for an audience. For decades, nobody outside the family had any idea she was involved. Then, letters found at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library showed the whole arrangement. Laura wrote drafts in longhand. Rose typed them, cut characters, rewrote scenes, and sent the final versions to the publisher. Rose was one of 3 founding figures of the American libertarian movement, alongside Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson. She despised FDR and the New Deal. Her diary says she believed America had a dictator. That belief shaped every editing choice. A self-reliant pioneer family doesn't work if there's a freeloader in the room. So the masters disappeared. The book also turns the winter into a story about Almanzo's heroism. There's a famous scene where he and a young man named Cap Garland ride into the blizzards to buy wheat from a lone settler in a sod shanty, saving the whole town. It's the scene people remember most. And when they bring the wheat back, there's another famous scene where a store owner named Loftus tries to charge a huge markup, and the townspeople shame him into lowering the price. The message is clear. The community polices itself. No government needed. At least one historian has argued that scene reads more like the 1930s, when Rose was editing the books, than the 1880s, when it supposedly happened. But as you've already heard, there's no record of that trip outside the Wilder family. Cap Garland died 10 years later in a threshing boiler explosion at 26, and his family passed down no story about it. The wheat seller wasn't a lone man, but Copperwood, with a wife and a baby and 2 houses. And the real person feeding the town, Amos Whiting, doesn't appear in the book at all. Neither does the grain behind the wall. But Rose didn't just leave things out. She made things up. Rose made the scene even bigger than Laura wrote it. In Laura's draft, the ride was 12 miles and they brought back 30 bushels. As Rose doubled both, Laura had them getting home safely. Rose rewrote it so the storm crashes down just as they barely spot a light in the distance. That near-death ending was entirely invented. But the changes to the wheat run weren't even the worst of it. An unnamed Native American man walks into a store and warns of 7 months of blizzards. He has no name, no tribe, speaks in broken English, and rides away like some kind of prophet. No source from the Times supports this. You already know what the book leaves out. De Smet sat on recently stolen Lakota land, and at that very moment, Sitting Bull was being forced to surrender. The whole frontier that the book celebrates was built on removal. None of that appears anywhere in the series. It's the most damaging silence in the entire book. And that old man is the last time a Native American plays any real role in any of the books. He shows up, gives a warning, and vanishes. In 2018, the American Library Association took Wilder's name off its Children's Literature Award because of the way the books handle race. The ending is the same way. The book closes with a cheerful May Christmas dinner. The floods that killed more people than the winter itself don't get a single word. Every change points the same direction. The family that needs nobody's help. the male hero who rides out to save the town, the frontier conquered by grit, the Indian who shows up with a warning and disappears. A founding myth about American self-reliance, built by a mother and daughter who believed that myth needed protecting even if the truth didn't fit. And it almost worked. Laura's original draft sat unpublished for over 80 years. It was called Pioneer Girl, and she'd written it in the early 1930s as a plain, honest account of her life before Rose turned the material into a children's series. When it finally came out in 2014, with full notes and context from scholars, it sold out its first printing almost immediately. Which raises a question nobody has a good answer for. If the real story was right there all along, sitting in a drawer, and people couldn't wait to read it the moment it came out, then who exactly was the myth protecting? The Ingalls family weren't the only ones living like this. All across the frontier, families were building lives out of nothing but dirt and grass and stubbornness. And some of what they built will change what you think was even possible out there.